Rocket League is known as one of the hardest games to pick up in terms of mechanics. As it's a physics-based game, you control everything that happens to your car, and that's what allows you to control where the ball goes. There are no buttons to pass, shoot, or do a skill move. You simply just have to practice moving your car in a certain way in order to do what you want with it. There are thousands of micro adjustments you have to make every game, and even if you're slightly off, it can ruin everything. Therefore, it is important that there are no variables that make these micro adjustments any more difficult. And what do I mean by this? Your settings. And I know what you're thinking, there are hundreds of videos on different settings, pro settings, and all sorts. However, a lot of these settings don't really explain much and can be quite all over the place. Plus, it's the new year, so it's good for people to be updated on what the best settings are. And not only am I going to show you what I believe are the best settings, I want to show what the settings can do and hopefully help you find the settings that you need. But I don't want to keep you waiting too long, so let's get right into the video. Now first is actually a brand new tab that was added into Rocket League in one of the recent patches, and that is the training settings. The game speed, you want it at 100% unless you want to train on slow mode, which a lot of people do. However, the wide majority of the time you're in training, you want it at 100%. Controls display is just whether you want the free play ball controls displayed in the corner. It's not that important, but if it distracts you, then turn it off. Now for goal reset, it's all down to your preference. I like to have this unchecked because if I score a nice goal in free play, I can watch the replay and clip it, but it's all up to you. Same with boost options. I personally believe having limited boost is good for players trying to increase speed and get more consistent, because you get to pick up pads around the field, and also you can only use 100 boost at a time. And a lot of the time I would be using over 100 boost when trying different mechanics, so it wasn't really realistic. A good idea is to use the auto refill and then set the boost recharge delay to minimum, therefore you can still practice just mechanics without having to pick up pads. Now to be honest, most of the gameplay settings I haven't really touched, and I don't really think you should either. Maybe cross-platform you might want to turn off for any reason. I usually have it on, but it's up to you. The rest aren't really that important unless you have serious internet problems, and then you might want to deep dive into these settings. But other than that, I have them set like this. And now into camera settings, probably the most important and most requested. Camera settings are extremely important as they change how the game looks, and if you have camera settings that look like this, then you're probably at a disadvantage compared to something like this. Now there are not set settings that everyone objectively has to use, however if you look up a lot of pros camera settings, they all seem to be within a range. So I would advise you to just stay within this range, or maybe just outside. But it is subjective, and if it helps you play better, then use whatever settings you want. So first of all, camera shake should be off, no exceptions, it's incredibly distracting and will only negatively affect your gameplay. Field of view is exactly what it sounds like, it's how wide your camera can see. And the majority of pros have this at max 110 for obvious reasons. The more you can see of the pitch, the more advantageous it is to you. However, if you're like me, you might struggle with your depth perception when it's at max, so if that's the case, then you can turn it down a little. I have it at 108, but I don't think it should ever be any lower than 105, and even then, that's still pretty low. Distance is simply the distance between your car and the camera, and nearly all pros have this at 270, which is what I have it at, but there are some pros that have it a little bit less or a little bit higher. I'd advise to keep it between 240 and 280. Height is just the height of the camera, and I personally have it at 110. And I wouldn't advise you to move the height around too much because it can really affect how you see the field. Most pros have it within the 90 and 110 range. I personally have it at the higher end because I like being able to see in front of the car a bit more, but I wouldn't have it much higher than that. Now the angle is basically the angle at which the camera looks at the car. The lower it is, the steeper it is. And I think this setting depends on what you have your height setting to. For example, I have a higher height at 110, so I have a higher angle at -4. However, looking at someone like Fatira, he has a low height at 90 and pairs it with a lower angle at -5. So the higher the height you have, the higher the angle you should also have. I'd personally keep it within -3 and -5. Stiffness is the amount the car zooms out while your car is driving fast. The lower it is, the more it zooms out, while if it's maxed out, it doesn't move at all. And honestly, this one's very subjective. Most pros have it as low as 0.3 and can go up to 0.6 or even 0.7. So honestly, I would just have a play around with it. Personally, I think having higher stiffness makes it harder to dribble because it feels too rigid and makes it difficult to turn. So I usually keep it at 0.3. Swivel speed is also another very subjective setting and is simply how fast you move your camera when panning with the right stick. Some pros have it really low, like apparently Jack, who has it on 2.2, and some pros have it really high, like Jan, who has it maxed out at 10. I personally think that's too high, and I can't even see when I try and turn the camera because it moves too fast. However, I guess it minimizes the time being spent trying to look around, so honestly, if it's not too fast for you, then I would suggest going higher. Lastly, transition speed. This is another one that is entirely up to you. It is basically how fast your camera switches on and off of ball cam. And recently at the World Championship, we saw Jan use maxed out transition speed. This means it instantly clicks right onto the ball and off when you press the button. Technically, this is actually more advantageous, however, for me, it makes me extremely disorientated when it's like that, so I usually keep it around 1.2. But honestly, if you can get it higher, then it's probably for the better. Camera settings are actually pretty important when playing Rocket League, but it doesn't help that the default camera is so bad. So I know it can be difficult to find camera settings that are right for you. That's why I wanted to kind of further explain how each setting affects your camera, because when I was new to the game, I had no idea what was ideal and what wasn't. But now that I have changed camera settings around a lot, I'm starting to find an understanding of what I want. However, you don't have to have your own camera settings, you can just copy pros and it should be fine. Now on to another extremely important section of the settings, the control settings. Control settings are important because it focuses on your bindings and sensitivity, and nothing's more important than how to control your car. So first we are going to go over bindings, so here are my bindings. They're a little different from default, but as you can see, using a PS4 controller, I have boost on X, jump on square, air roll and power slide on L1, and air roll right on R1. And those are most of the important controls. Now you don't have to completely follow these binds. I think binds are very subjective. However, there are key points that I personally feel you must follow. One of those is to have power slide and free air roll bound to the same button, and that is simply because it's a waste of space to have them on different binds. Power slide and air roll simply cannot be used at the same time, so it's way more efficient to just have them on the same button. Now the other key point is that you must be able to press boost, jump and air roll at the same time without any issues. There are countless situations where you have to press these buttons at the same time, or you'll have to transition from one to the other almost instantly. So it's just extremely important and useful to be able to press these buttons at the same time. Like I said, you don't have to copy my bindings, you can have completely different configuration, but just stick to those rules. Now we are on to sensitivity. Sensitivity is extremely important as it controls how far you have to move the joystick in order to turn a certain amount. And this seems like it could be pretty subjective, however I disagree. A lot of people might say the higher the better, and while you're technically right on paper, Rocket League requires so much precision and accuracy the higher level you play at, and all the micro adjustments are simply borderline impossible to control when your sensitivity is too high. So even though sensitivity goes up to 10, I would highly advise you to keep your sensitivity within 1 and 2, especially if you're a new player. Even though there are players like Monkey Moon who use a 3.9 steering and aerial sensitivity, who is one of the most consistent players in RLCS. However, I personally just think having over a 2 is just very difficult to control, especially when you need very precise controls in a game like Rocket League. I personally use a 1.4 steering sensitivity and a 1.5 aerial sensitivity, so maybe try some different ones and see what's best for you. But as I already said, I would keep it in between 1 and 2. Your controller dead zone is how far you have to push your joystick in one direction before your car actually makes a movement. And honestly, you want this as low as possible. I have mine at 0.05, but you probably want it under 0.1. Unless you have stick drift, and if that's the case, then you want to raise it until you no longer feel it. Dodge dead zone is a little similar, but it's how far you push your joystick until you're able to dodge in that direction. I have mine at 0.3, but I've changed it quite a few times. If you seem to have trouble with backflipping and going for aerials, then I suggest you raise it to maybe 0.5 or higher. And honestly, I don't think having it higher or lower makes it better or worse, it just depends on what you're comfortable with. Finally, controller vibration, I would have that off. It personally is just really distracting for me. However, I don't think it has any effect on your gameplay, so if you like it on, then keep it. The rest of the control settings should be kept the same, most of them are for keyboard users anyway, so you won't need to touch them. Now for the interface settings, most of these you shouldn't really touch. The only one I want to talk about is nameplate scale. and I usually have this on max. I personally like it on max because not only is it easier to see in general, but there are a lot of times when players hide themselves behind the ball when you're shadow defending. And there are times with a max nameplate scale that you can still see the movement of their name tag, and that helps with understanding their next move. So personally, I think you should have this as high as possible. Finally, the last section of the settings I want to talk about is your video settings. And honestly, these could really vary on how strong your PC is and also what monitor you have. I have a 1440p 144Hz monitor, so my settings might be different from yours. Now resolution is one that depends on your monitor. However, most people play on 1080p, which is using 1920 by 1080 16:9 ratio. I play in 1440p purely because my monitor can run it and my PC is powerful enough to do it while keeping high frames. Display mode should always be full screen because if you run any others, then your performance will be affected heavily. This is because using windowed or borderless means that your computer will actually still be putting resources into all background applications, and this means less is being used for Rocket League. So to avoid all of that, always use full screen. Now VSync should always be off because it can heavily affect your input delay. Now going down to basic settings, anti-aliasing should always be off. It does make your game look a little cleaner, but it's at the cost of how fast the game runs. Render quality I like to keep on high quality even though it slightly affects performance. And this is because the game just doesn't look adequate if it's on lower settings, and it looks very difficult to play on. Render detail will be adjusted later, so just leave that for now. And with frames per second, you want to have that capped as high as possible. And this is because capping frames lower means your input delay increases. So even if your monitor doesn't have a high refresh rate, still cap it as high as you can to decrease your input delay. Now on to the advanced settings. You want texture detail on high quality, and then world and particle detail should be on performance. However, if your PC starts to struggle with these settings, then you can definitely put the qualities at lower. Effect intensity should also be at low, and with all these boxes below, you should have all of them unchecked other than transparent goalposts. This is simply to maximize performance, and honestly most of these details can be quite distracting. If you really want one of them on, then I would suggest high quality shaders as it looks a bit nicer with it on. But other than that, all the other boxes should be ticked off other than transparent goalposts. Now audio and chat settings I'm not going to go through because it is simply down to how you want them. And nothing you change directly impacts your gameplay, so it's not worth going through. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it helped you find the right settings for you. I really wanted to actually talk about what the settings did and how they impact your gameplay. And this is because even though you can go and just copy a pro's settings and play on them, those settings were made by each pro for their individual gameplay, so there's a high chance that they might not be perfect for you. Therefore, this video is really about trying to find you the settings for you. So if it did help, I would really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe and comment on whether you found the right settings or not. And if you really want to support me further, I would appreciate it if you could use code OneEyedGhoul in the support a creator section in the Rocket League store when you buy something. But anyways, that's all from me for now. I'll see you guys next time.